So today's topic is something you've probably seen, and I'll give you a few contexts to kind of frame it of where you have, I guarantee you have seen this. But maybe you didn't have the words or the articulation for what that means or what it is. And it's something called the literary intentional fallacy. And what that is a product of postmodernist thinking, basically the idea that perception shapes reality rather than you need to shape your perceptions to match reality. It's that the easiest way to summarize, if you're talking about modernistic objectivity versus postmodernist subjectivity, is that over here, facts don't care about your feelings, and then over here you have feelings don't care about your facts. Like that's kind of like that's where it is of that over here where I feel like you've done violence to me, I feel like you've hurt me, or that I feel oppressed, things like that's all over here, whereas whether or not someone has experienced violence, oppression, whatever, is over here, right? So that's one of the major ways that we see this, especially election year politics, stuff like that. But a lot of it comes down to who's in charge here is the major questions that it asks. Who's in charge? Over here, objective reality facts are what's in charge. That's what should be determining reality. Over here, feelings, perceptions, sensations, that's what's over here, and that's what's in charge. And this dominates, that dichotomy, that separation between these two matrices is what kind of patterns everything of like who's in charge. Is it the government or is it the people, right? Is it the one up top or is it the one down below? Is it the wealthy or is it the poor? Like every single dichotomy of like who is in charge here. And the literary intentional fallacy is another example of that, but it specifically focuses on content, usually written texts content, but it also can apply has attempted to be applied in a limited way towards other realms of content like video or I don't know, YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, right? The reason there's limits on the way that it can apply to modern delivery mechanisms is that the literary intentional fallacy, let's break it down, literary, like words, right? Literature. Intentional is that the mental capacity or the mental state behind that text, right? The mind relating to the author. Fallacy basically is referring to that it's impossible to put literature and that mental state, that intentions together. They're separate things. Now, under modernism, if you read a piece of text, the mindset of the audience was that I'm interacting with that person individually. It's like they would even write that way, of that if they were reading from past texts or like theologian, let's say if they're responding to older theologians, they wouldn't write to abolition of man. They would write to C.S. Lewis. They would not write addressing critique or criticism towards Frankenstein. They would address it towards Marie Wollstonecraft Shelley, right? Like just that's the way that they were thinking. Over here in postmodernism, however, they're not necessarily going to direct it towards Mary Shelley. They're not going to necessarily direct it towards Shakespeare or Emily Bronte. They're going to direct it towards Frankenstein or towards Romeo and Juliet instead. They're going to direct things like open letters towards fictional characters. That is 100% the matter of subjectivity right there. Not just responding into the essence of things, but when you're talking about people are trying to critique how a character of a fictional thing was doing something and how it's wrong, that is postmodernism, because they're not critiquing necessarily how a character was written. They're critiquing the character itself. So it constitutes a pretty significant literary technique, because what it asserts, its basis, its foundation, is the impossibility of knowing the mind of an author of a piece of text. And that is why you don't see it used very much, let's say, with YouTube videos or tweets. Because if I tweet at Donald J. Trump, likelihood is he's going to see it and then he's going to respond to it, right? That gets dialogue immediately. And that's why there's press briefings at the White House, and that's why things like that are that reaching out to the desk or the publicist of fill in the blank for comment is, if you can get to a person who is alive and contact them with questions. Let's say I want to learn more about the Harry Potter universe. I could reach out potentially to J.K. Rowling herself through various means and potentially get a direct response about that content, about that question, about that whatever, right? And that eliminates a lot of the wiggle room present that these literary intentional fallacy critics want to use. See, that's why you'll see them, they tend to focus on the works and the creators that are already dead. Whether that's Shakespeare, whether that's Mark Twain, whether that's Mary Shelley, come up multiple times, but Mary Shelley, or it's the Bible, it's the Code of Hammurabi, if it's the Greek classics, the Quran. They want to focus on that stuff because of the assumption that the people who were behind that document, the authors, they're dead, and the dead can't fight back. So they might have followers, like let's say there's the C.S. Lewis Society, or the somebody like that, or the estate of J.R.R. Tolkien takes issue with your interpretation or your allegorization of their content. They can reach out, but still, that's not the original person. And that's why you see people putting, like, the daughter of Martin Luther King Jr. on a pedestal of that. That's the daughter of Martin Luther King Jr. So that's kind of like getting commentary from MLKJ on something, but it's not actually him. It's far enough away that if somebody wants to criticize that content or her words, it's like, it's not really him, but it's close enough to being him for that if someone agrees with what she's saying, they can defend that as well on that grounds of that this is his daughter, right? And so we see how this kind of interweaves itself or interposes itself all over our society. If somebody is a Trump supporter, you bring up something Trump has said, then there's going to be like the support, and then there's the detractors automatically on the basis of usually this right here. Most sound bites and proof texting is based on something that's a derivative from this called a hermeneutical circle. See, if I take the author out of the scenario, and you imagine that it's author, text, audience, if I take the author out of the picture and it's just me and a piece of text, now the author, assuming the author was human, assuming I am human, we're now equals. And if that's the case, him and I, like her and I are equals, then we have equal right to impose on the text our minds. So my assumption, which is what the hermeneutical circle is, my assumptions determine my interpretation of the text. if I assume a Marxist perspective, if I assume a feminist perspective, if I assume a sexually liberated perspective, then I can look at a piece of text, which because of our society rarely ever being precisely clean cut, very few times you'll see somebody give a speech, write a book, whatever, that is monochromatic or monotone when it comes to only addressing this one thing. It's going to address a lot of things, and they're going to come kind of like they're going to weave back and forth, address this, no, now I'll come back to that later, so forth. Especially if it's an amalgamated work, or if it's something that has been around a long time from a different like social era than what we live in now. It's gonna there'll be a little things in there that if you're a capitalist, if you're a Marxist, if you're a feminist, if you're any of these things, like you can grab a hold of little pieces, pull that out, and just say, that's the heart, that's the meaning, that's the value, that's the primary takeaway of this text. That's what soundbiting is. Take a paragraph of text, 4-word phrase, pull that out, put it into a tweet, put quotes around it, and now I have just used a hermeneutical circle to assume that that's what's the most meaningful thing, interpreted that through my assumption, and now stated it as an objective fact about that text. And this is one of the most frustrating things. If you're trying to find good sources of modern discourse, if you're trying to find good dialogue on matters, it's so frustrating because you always see bracketed quotes, ellipses, sound bites. It makes it very difficult to try and form an objective opinion because, quite frankly, they don't want you to have an objective opinion. They don't want you to form an objective opinion. They want to give you a subjective opinion. Does that make... I think that's kind of what we're getting at, right? So that's why they love talking about the products of ancient authors. Dead people can't protest, right? But where it starts to unravel really quickly is in the matter of deplatforming. See, in our social spheres, especially university and like high school, public education spheres, there's a lot of chatter about the idea of deplatforming older works in order to limit the influence of buzzword stuff like feminism, like sexuality, or like the racism, and to limit the influence that these things have that supposedly is encapsulated in these documents. And they'll use arguments that are shaped like this. Shakespeare was an anti-Semite. And they'll quote, let's say, The Merchant of Venice in order to justify that. Or they'll say Mark Twain was a white supremacist because of his, and they'll quote his, let's say, liberal use of the N-word in Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer, that as evidence of that reality. And so we need to remove this document from public discourse, from public discussion, and from public consumption, because it's a time capsule of a mental state, racism, or white supremacy, or sexism, right? We need to remove this from that, from everywhere around us, in order to get rid of that mental state. Well, my question now, if it's true that literary intentional fallacies assumption that it's impossible to know the mind of a creator, if that's impossible, then how do you know that whoever it is, William Shakespeare, held that mental state. How do you know? And then inevitably they'll point towards sound bites, proofreading, proof texting of this text, that text, this text to say, yes, he was an anti-Semite. But supposedly those two things are separated, right? They are essentially and insuperably separate. So if that's the case, then this text isn't racist, because you're using it as a mirror, not a message, that if there's sexism here, it's because it's reflecting off of you, and that's why you see it there, right? Problems with the, like, so you can see how, like, this unravels itself pretty quickly, but that doesn't really matter, because our society also is more than willing to indict someone on the basis of thought crime that's just been accused, or like the accusation of thought crime, rather than waiting for an objective reality of it, because they don't want objective reality, they want subjective interpretation, perception. And the way that we see this in the Bible, in Christian circles, it comes down to really two major things. The Bible it's not inspired, it's not inerrant. That's what they say, that it's not inspired, so they'll talk about the human authors of Scripture really intensively, saying that either that human is the primary author, the primary originator, and has only limited inspirative details or features, or that the Holy Spirit didn't inspire it at all. Because that allows you to have a dead author rather than a living author, and a dead author cannot argue or protest when you misrepresent their work. They want a dead author. And so they're assuming the author is dead, which gives them more license to say whatever they want. And so what I've been seeing a lot of lately is arguments that Paul never met Jesus. And the reason that they make that argument, in disregarding his like the Damascus Road experience, which has become a cultural colloquialism, right? Or a cultural idiom. Disregarding that, because what they're saying is, well, the Bible's not inspired, and that is an error. It's just inserted in there. It doesn't belong. It's just put in there in order to shore up Paul's lack of apostolic authority. That's the argument that's being made. Bible's not inerrant. There's an error there that says that Paul met Jesus. That's not true. And now Paul doesn't have the authority to say in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 9 through 11 that homosexuality is sin, or in Romans 1 that clearly describing homosexuality as sin. He didn't have the authority to do that because he never met Jesus. Well, if Paul never had authority in the church, then that means that Luke, who is the author of Acts and the Gospel of Luke, he didn't have the authority to write those books either, because his primary authority to do so comes from his companionship to Paul, who was an apostle, right? So he loses his. So that's, Luke wrote 50% of the total verse tonnage. If you just pile up all the verses written by Luke and Acts, that's 50% of the New Testament. Take Paul, which is half of Acts, that features him, and then also all of his letters. You've got 3 Gospels, Mark and Matthew and then John, right? And then you've got Peter's 2, James, Hebrews, although we don't know the author of him, so probably not even that. You have Jude, you have Revelation, and you got 3 epistles from John. And that's it. That's all you have left. And so that gives you so much more leeway. But Mark, he wrote that after being mentored by Paul and Peter, which he never meets Peter if he hadn't been mentored by Paul. And so now we take his off, but Priory of Mark suggests that Mark was a major leading source referenced by Matthew, and if Mark is not reliable, then Matthew's off the table now as well. So that leaves you with John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, 2 epistles from Peter, and Revelation. Well, that leaves you with all sorts of leeway. And I mean, if you started already there, that we've already taken out, if you take out Paul's letters, you have, I mean, all scripture is God breathed from 2 Timothy chapter 3. You have those things like, and so now you have even more leeway to say, well, those weren't breathed out by God either. That was just human author. Like, and so you can see how how they're going about this, right? And so what you have left over is the only reason that you removed any of that text, the only reason you withdrew or you painted out the authority of all these different books is because you wanted to do that. It's that hermeneutical circle again. It's because you wanted to do that. You wanted to see this text as a mirror reflecting your values rather than you seeing it as a message from someone who wants you to reflect its values. And you'll see as well simply that they won't even contend on the surface of inerrancy and the inspiration of Scripture because they don't believe it. They've already ruled that out. They've already ruled it out, so they don't believe that, and that is the primary source material of their theology. So that's where false teaching comes from. In our modern era, that is what false teaching, that's what gives birth to it, essentially. And so when you see people talking about, endorsing and permitting this sin or that sin, it's not that they are simply like agreeing to disagree with us. It's that they are asserting a different authority than we are.